Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to Hieros Gamos Radio, broadcasting out of the Lower Triangle, Tasmania, the descending tongue of grace, adrift in the freezing waters of Mem between mainland Australia and Antarctica, howling like the hanged man when the hot water runs out. Hieros Gamos is the sacred wedding of matter and spirit, life and art, thelema and Tao. We treat ourselves to one special guest each program. We don't care about their latest book, art show or Tinder profile. We go straight to the heart and mind and draft up an indelible portrait of thinkers and feelers and knowers of the new aeon. Let's get busy with the crowned prince of chaos, the eye of the storm, the wanderer in the wastes, the Australian artist who has been busting holes in the watchtowers and tearing down the veils for over 30 years, Barry William Hale. Perhaps we can begin at the beginning with your childhood experiences, your magical life growing up in Western Sydney, and your first inkling of the invisible world.
Okay. Yeah, well, I suppose, when I was young, I remember in infant school having a existential crisis underneath a tree, I think in second class, sort of just questioning, why am I here? What's it all about and stuff. I think it was kind of precipitated by some other events. And then sort of seemed to have I just kind of questioned myself. It was kind of probably pretty early to have those questions, but it happened nonetheless. And I suppose the other thing is when I was kind of young, I had a lot of kind of experiences where I sort of felt like I was kind of harangued by spirits and things like that. So, which I kind of found it was kind of quite an ordeal for me when I was young, but I kind of got through that. And I think that if I sort of look at the orientation to my later endeavours in the Western esoteric tradition and other spiritual kind of pursuits, my father and grandfather were Masons, and so we had this kind of really, this kind of quite stately portrait of my great-grandfather, in the shed in his Royal Arch regalia, and also at the top of the wardrobe in my parents' house were my great-grandfather's Masonic cases and my father's Masonic case, where he would get, dressed up in his tuxedo and go off to lodge, I kind of put two and two together, but at any opportunity when both of my parents were out, I was like, moving the chair so I could kind of pull down their Masonic cases and thumbing through their jewels and the Masonic Bible and looking at the pictures and stuff. So I was kind of really fascinated by that. And I think if you kind of like move on to being involved in different magical fraternities and stuff, sort of seems to make sense. So I was kind of always, and also my parents were, they subscribed, we started getting it was kind of a serialized magazine called the Unexplained, and from the newsagent, and that was like and Man, Myth and Magic, and those two things were just like a veritable like treasure trove of I don't know, like anything from werewolves to internal human combustion to astral traveling, out of body experiences, and auric, auras, and just a fantastic sort of collection of stuff. And we also had a set of encyclopedias that was pretty well worn in the mythological section, and I had a particular fascination with the Egyptian pantheon. So some of my earliest drawings were sort of like my reproductions copied from the encyclopedia of the Egyptian zoomorphic gods and stuff like that. And then, I used to get those kind of like, at that, I think it was one of the things that young boys got, in that sort of age, was like, amazing tales and all of that, those kind of, what are the sort of science fiction, horror kind of anthology books. And that was probably enough to kind of keep me quite occupied. And then and then from there, I think I was kind of like I was out in the garden, like staring at like leaves and stuff until I could kind of see auras, and I'd sit and like look at people and really concentrate. And then other experiments is with trying to kind of like do telekinetic, kind of trying to make things move with my mind, or trying to get the teacher to stutter, and just all of these sort of things. And so, and there's sort of a lot of different things. We would go down to Kiama to a caravan park, and there was an old lady there, and she was a bit of a kind of incredibly knowledgeable in Andaluvian type of things, and Atlantis, and she had these kind of books that were kind of, she was always like, I was just this young kid who'd sit at the table with the old lady because I just loved to listen to these stories. So I suppose like a lot of different combinations. And when I was 5.5, I started martial arts, and that was kind of, and it sort of I was kind of quite taken by the Bushido kind of creed and stuff. So there was like all of these sort of different influences, I suppose. And
came at it from quite a few different angles.
Yeah.
Really.
I suppose so.
Yeah.
I haven't really given it like a lot of thought, but when I think about it, it sort of seems like a good.
You've been in the current for a long time then, really.
Well, yeah, I think it's I think it's norm. I think kids exposed to that sort of stuff, like a lot of people have like a religious upbringing. I hear a lot of people say, well, I was a Catholic, so of course I'm into folk voodoo and folk magic and stuff like that. And so it's like I didn't have any religious upbringing, and but an equal fascination with religiosity, spirituality, like things like that. So I mean, I think it comes from unlikely sources, and so I think that's from my younger years. But I had my first OBE, my out of body experience. Well, when I was young, I was like doing a lot of experimentation with what I thought was astral traveling, and I think that the family environment and sort of living in the western suburbs, I really didn't feel like I never really felt like I fitted in. Yeah. I felt like I was sort of some way a bit different. I was also adopted, so I don't know, like I didn't have a sort of a sense of, like, I suppose I think this might relate to the existential crisis. I think I was sort of pondering, like, well, who are you? You don't have any roots. You don't. You know what I mean? Like, and it was kind of like, oh, I'm just. I had a great family, like, and stuff like that. And I think that so I would experiment a lot with these sort of ideas and these different the magazines and stuff like that. And I had I used to experiment with what I thought was astral traveling, but I mean later I realized that it was like etheric body journaling, like etheric projection, because it was kind of a form of escape too, in a way. Like I would collapse with a pen and paper, and I was a very probably should have been medicated because I was kind of like pretty ADD, I reckon. And
just active.
Oh, well, just like my mum say, oh, that's kids and stuff. But, she was really happy if I had a pen in my hand because, like no one could talk to me in a way. I just sort of shut off from the world. And I think that also, for whatever reason, the environment was conducive for me to kind of, have this yearning to kind of get out of, my body or something like that. And so I'd have these sort of nightly, I'd go through the process of, like visualizing myself above my body and having a cord and going out. But what I realized, much later is that the world that I used to kind of like slowly kind of explore was a facsimile of the world that I lived in, which is kind of like different to the astral realm, which is kind of really a lot more plastic and it's affected by the imagination. I mean, it can be, as fantastic as possible, but my experience of like floating and walking around my room, walking around the house, flying above my house, going going to see other people's, like, friends, or, trying to, exploring, and then just slowly spiraling out was kind of like it was like a facsimile of, on a subtler level of what the earthly world was. And one time, and this would go on for many years, then one time I thought, I want to go outside of the stratosphere. Like, I want to leave the earth.
Wow.
And because I used to get, like, I used to fly around, and I, and I thought, well, let's just go to outer space or something like that, And so I remember, so I go, well, all I got to do is just keep going up.
Yeah, right.
And so I'm kind of going up and up and up and up, and then it was kind of like I hit these kind of bands or something, it's sort of like a little, like, there'd be a zone, and then it would propel me into this next zone, and it was getting kind of faster and faster, and it kind of sort of ruptured through this next zone, and I could feel I was getting closer and closer to, like, the outer stratosphere, and I'm just like going really, really fast by the end of it, and then I kind of like burst the bubble, went out, and then it was just like bang. It was like I was sort of like hit by a bolt of lightning, and I was kind of broken, and I was just out there, and I was just kind of like floating, and I had no control over my my projected body that I was in. And then it was just like, holy shit. And then I just kind of plummeted down through the things, down, and I could see the sort of colours, could see the, the suburb and the lights, and I could see the house and see the thing, and I smacked back into my body. And then I lost the ability to do it for many, many years.
How old were you when you
well,
did that?
it's I would say, well, it's definitely like, quite a few years before high school.
Yeah, wow.
So, maybe 9, 10, 11, something like that.
Most people say they, children have an active imagination, but that's beyond active imagination. That's
it's interesting because it's like interesting because that active imagination, like later on, I met, friends, and then, also, like just different ideas about astral traveling. And I just realized that, like, okay, well, this is etheric body traveling, I kind of, and because there's not, it's not like you're kind of in a lucid dream, or you're, the narrative starts speaking to you, and then things come plastic, and you're kind of lucid and within fantastical world, which is like a malleable kind of Maic matrix of your mind or whatever it is, and things start sort of acting independently of their own volition. It's kind of like, well, what's happened? And it's like, oh, here you are. And so I kind of realized that, like, a long time. But I did have an experience when I was a bit older than that, when I was sort of preparing for kind of a martial arts grading, and I had to stand in horse stance for 1 hour. Which is, yeah. There was like,
that's grueling.
And I remember it really vividly. It's sort of like at a dojo on Mulgoa Road out the back of Penrith, and it was kind of like a hot sort of night, sort of like a midsummer kind of night. So it was kind of like pretty steamy and quite hot. And I just remember after like 7 minutes or something, and I'm just like staring at a brick wall, and there's a clock there. You know what I mean? And there's a couple of other people with me, and it's just like these pools of sweat, like at the bottom of my feet, like coming out of my gi. I'm sort of shaking, and I'm just sort of doing it, and I don't know how long had gone by, but and then I just like found myself out of my body. I just went through the brick wall, and I'm kind of like flying around. I had this full OBE, right? And then gradually came back, and then the hour had elapsed, and it was all cool, right? But it was like a full immersive kind of experience, which is sort of it was a bit different than that other experience, but it was their kind of some sort of experiences, I suppose, like from, I suppose, like, childhood or early adolescence, and
it's amazing. It really is. That's for sure.
I had. Then when I was, the western suburbs was a pretty bleak suburban kind of reality. And I remember when my first year of high school, we were walking to school or got off the bus, you kind of, and there's a new shop that had opened, and then I was kind of walking home you know. We usually caught the bus, but, you know, sometimes I like to walk, you know, it's a bit of a trek, but... And there was a shop, and it was like kind of like a new age shop, right? And I'd never been there. And sort of had like crystals, and it had all this stuff, and I was like, wow, what's this, you know? So we kind of like went in the door, you know, the little ding 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 kind of goes, and I go in, and it's like this kind of like, you know, this masses of like, you know, big lumps of crystal and all these magical books and all of this stuff, and I walked in there, and I just, you know, I kind of exclaimed, wow, this place feels really different, or something like that. And the lady behind the counter says, right. You just kind of latched on to me. And then the next thing I know, I'm in the back doing a past life regression with this lady, right? You know, like, she was like, right, you're there's something about that kid or something, right? And, you know, she was quite old. I mean, she was like, maybe she's not too old, like maybe like 40s or 40, you know what I mean? Something like that. So I'm only just like 13, or, you know, just at first year of high school, you know. And then that led to, like, I started, you know, it's between 13 and 14, I started hanging out with these old ladies. And there was quite a kind of a lively... spiritual, like, there was a lot of stuff going on in the suburbs. There always is, you know what I mean? It's like, you know, there might be these kind of like old ladies that read teacups or something, and they're just like fully connected, you know, like they're just like doing their thing, you know. This sort of stuff, like, just, you find it everywhere, you know. It's not like, and it's sometimes in some really quirky places, and sometimes people doing sort of quirky stuff, but they were kind of like the real McCoy. And so I was kind of invited to kind of their like sort of like spiritual circles. So I'm like in this, you know, I'm sitting around holding hands with like people that are like my grandmother's age, right? And a couple of other sort of, you know, there's some, you know, there's like some, you know, Jesuit brother, some this, some that, you know, like, and actually like Anita Cobby's father, you know, and she was like a kind of, it was a big news around that time. She was like a beauty princess or something, and she got really horrendously murdered in Mulgoa, and he'd sort of, I think the only way he could possibly come to terms with his, you know, his daughter's, you know, murder, he found his spirit, you know, solace in his spiritual sort of, you know, spirituality or something. So he was there, and there was all these people, and, you know, and we were sitting around holding hands, like doing these group chakra meditations, moving, like, you know, like, and just like kind of cosmic stuff, you know, like. And, you know, and there was different practices, you know, we're all kind of sitting there projecting, you know, like beams of light sort of all going and passing, rotating heart chakras, and everyone's like chanting, and it's like this is projecting it, and it's like good shit, right? And I'm just, you know, and I'm just like a kid, right? And these are all these like amazing old ladies who were like prominent members in the spiritualist church and stuff like that. They've been doing this shit all, you know, and other sort of stuff. There was some new age sort of stuff chucked in there and stuff like that, but, you know, their base was really kind of pretty solid, you know, tarot readers, like the whole shebang. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of odd preoccupation, you know, like other people were, I don't know, doing other stuff, you know, and
playing cricket or something.
Yeah, but then afterwards, you know, afterwards, I was never really into sports, you know. I was always kind of like I don't know, it's like incredibly uncoordinated or something, and always sort of found, like, you know, tried soccer, reserve, tried something else, reserve. I was always the kid on the bench. So, and I think that's why I really took to martial arts, because like it was just something that it was like you and yourself and I, you know what I mean, like it was like you it wasn't like a team, not that I wasn't a, you know, I just didn't the team whole thing, you know, it just didn't really work out for me. There was always like someone who was like the best in the team, and there's always like, you know, all of this sort of stuff, and then these like, you know, parents, you know, like cheering from the sideline, and you just like, oh fuck man, this is the pits. So I just wanted to be like some, you know, I don't know, like some sort of Zen, sort of like, you know, Okinawan like karate practitioner that went and, you know, in the winter with the Zen monks and like sat underneath a freezing cold waterfall, because I thought that's just it, you know. I always sort of thought that I would end up in some like Buddhist monastery somewhere, or with these Zen monks or something. And like had a very, and there was sort of like within the structure of like the second style that I did was kind of like there was a kind of like a strong. It was almost, I wouldn't call it like it's like, conceive, believe, achieve, like it was kind of like this kind of, and there was sort of like this sort of like quasi kind of Eastern Bushido meets some other sort of thing, and it was sort of like a composite, so it was sort of like spiritual warrior kind of, it was kind of that sort of like, I suppose that a whole samurai sort of ninja whatever thing, and I really liked it. I really liked the discipline, I really liked the structure, and it had sort of like a big impact, and it's sort of something that I kind of kept up into my up until this day, but there was something magical about it as well, like the guy, he held the world record in breaking 2,500 pounds of ice with a descending elbow. I mean, this was 5 huge slabs of ice. I mean, he was the embodiment of these principles. He walked past you when you were sort of like standing very still, and you could kind of feel the hairs move like a magnet, like from one side to the other on the back of your neck. Like the guy was like a powerhouse,
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of power in that, I think, for sure.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah. Sounds like you primed yourself from an early age, too. You sort of knew what you were going to do later on in life, quite young, from these stories.
Yeah, it's hard to sort of say why you're attracted to certain things. So, like, sometimes in hindsight, I think it kind of, like, some things kind of make sense of you, sort of, your journey. If you kind of really... you kind of go, oh, this happened because of this. You can sort of see sort of some sort of grand narrative, I think. Perhaps, I mean, I couldn't say that it's all really clear, but sometimes you go, well, that's interesting. That happened because of that,
Oh, when looking back at things, you realise those connections and why you are who you are today because of those things, and it all makes sense, but...
For better or worse sometimes.
For better or worse, for sure. In a retrospective sense, though, you don't necessarily know what you're doing at the time.
Yeah, who fully knows who fully knows the true end of all their acts, like.
All right. Well, let's move on and tell us about the OTO and the Wild Frontier Days in Sydney.
Okay, so I left home early, and I I also sort of applied to go to art college as well, and so I think punk rock and hardcore music had a really big influence, and like the suburb that I was from, St. Mary's, had a venue called the Wagon Wheels, and that was kind of like the heavy metal that was the heavy metal mecca of the West, but I was kind of like into punk rock and had all these mates into like, Slayer and, and all of that sort of stuff. We kind of got on quite well. And I think that I really found, I think there was something, punk and hardcore, really provided a really good outlet for an angry young teenager who was just like, it was sort of like the energy and sort of like I felt like I probably gravitated because I needed to embrace something that was a point of difference as well, I think, and it was sort of like and it embodied that sort of youthful defiance and in a way, and that sort of kind of took me into town quite a lot. I was always going to see, gigs and stuff, and meeting people, and
burning off some energy.
Yeah, and it sort of made really good friends, and then that sort of led into me squatting. So it's like I was a squatter, and I suppose, and then and I was going to art school.
That all works well together,
Punk,
art school, squatting.
Yeah. So around that sort of time, I used to spend a lot of time in Newtown. Well, I was actually squatting in Newtown, and so, you know, we were kind of like, we were drinking in pubs and stuff like there, and just with your friends and stuff, and Newtown was really different than what it is now, but it still had that very alternative, and it sort of had the sort of like university socialist thing. You had the Irish or whatever, you had all of this kind of working class. It was a really kind of colourful place, and I pretty much sort of crashed into the OTO, you know, just, you know, like through just being in Newtown and stuff like that. Yeah, and I kind of and you know, I kind of met some members and stuff, and I met sort of Shiva, and you know, he's a previous incarnation. And it was really good, and we would have these conversations and stuff, and you know, they'd be talking about Crowley, and I'd be kind of like, you know, it sort of had this sort of feeling like, you know, this is a really good articulation of what it's sort of like. It's kind of drawing my own ideas out of my mouth, but it's so much you know, so better articulated. I was like, wow, this is like, what is this, you know?
Did you have a did you know about the OTO prior to crashing into it at all?
Yeah, kinda. Not overly, I don't think. I mean, I'd come across a little bit of the, you know, the Golden Dawn. I've sort of started looking into the Golden Dawn a little bit, and you know, some other things, but I didn't, you know, I knew who Crowley was and stuff, but I didn't really know what the OTO really was, and I think. And then I think then I was kind of invited to go and see a Gnostic Mass, and this is in 1989. And, you know, we've been kind of getting to know each other, and I was just sort of like, you know, I used to like, you know, I was, you know, and I would just sort of started art college, you know, so I was kind of exploring philosophy, and, you know, like it was a great time, you know, sort of like research journal, like there was a lot of really William Burroughs, like Brian Geisen. It was like a really rich time of like, there was some good stuff happening. There's a lot of like experimental music and a lot of really great stuff. And I think art college and just that sort of environment, you know, and in Newtown and stuff, like just there was some really interesting people. And I went to a Gnostic Mass, and I was like, what just happened? You know, like it really kind of had you know, for me, it was a very, you know, it was sort of like it was a real thing. You know, I was like, wow, I just don't fucking get what's going on here. You know what I mean? Like I do, but something really, and I was like, wow, I just really need to understand it.
Yeah.
And so I kind of just went, radio, like, see you later. And then I sort of went away for a couple of years, because I said, well, I got to start reading. So I looked up some sort of Crowley related reading list and things like that. And I'd already been reading some material like that, but I just went, okay. And I think I've picked up the Kabbalah Denunta, and it was just like this most abstruse Kabbalistic kind of, you know, and I was just like, fuck, man, you know, this is really dense. And I was not much of a reader, you know, when I was at school. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy school very much. And you know, for a few different reasons, you know, my literacy sort of wasn't really great. I just sort of kind of skipped the, you know, just the way you know, it's the way it sort of fell. I had some kind of like hearing issues when I was really young at the formative sort of periods, and I think that sort of like maybe put me behind the 8 ball slightly. So then I ended up in the naughty kids class up the back, and it's like, well, who's teaching whatever, you know? It's like 1984. I like 1984, you know, like, but basically didn't read that much, or didn't really, you know, it wasn't a really.
Why did this capture though for reading? Because I mean, there's a lot of texts to read, and a lot of them is quite dense. You know, it's for someone who just said that is, you know, reading was a bit more difficult at that time. Why did you just continue?
Because I had to. I said I'm not going to be this. I'm not going to be conquered by language. I'm just going to not let this. I'm going to stick with it till I work this shit out.
Oh, good on
and
you.
I had this kind of a real, you know, stubborn determination. There was no way that I wasn't gonna, you know, this is I was gonna stick with it till I got it. I just happened to pick up that book, which was like, you know, well, particularly. But then I read some other stuff, and Yeah, and so I was kind of exploring some of these sort of ideas as well at art college, and during the period, what I came to realise is that what had happened was Grady McMurtry, so Hymenaeus Alpha had chartered Heather, who was the woman who brought the OTO to New Zealand and Australia, and she'd spent time with him in California, and she's quite a remarkable lady, and she had so it was kicking, like it was really kicking in the 80s, and I think that things had sort of become really, I think there was a lot of problems. There was, in that time in Sydney as well, and that sort of went over to the time that I was kind of involved with the sort of like punk rock and squatting scene. There was a lot of drugs,
Yeah.
There was, heroin was an epidemic.
Yeah, right.
And, there's this sort of thing, there's this thing where you kind of mix magic and drugs. It's people kind of, you'd hear these sort of things where people are kind of like quoting Crowley or something, and like, and then sort of using like Crowley as some excuse for their, their drug addiction. It's like, oh man, come on, like you've really, and as a result, a lot of friends are no longer here.
Yeah.
And that was within and without the order, you know what I mean? Like, so it was just a really bad scene. And I think also there was other sort of internal problems. And I think that, well, basically, like, I think from what Shiva tells me, that around that time, it sort of reached a climax. There was like a lot of conflict, and Heather got sick, and she was like, look, I can't, she said, you need to, she was passing the baton to Shiva, and he was like, oh, no, like, I'll just take care of it for you. He's really loyal, you know what I mean? It's just like, no, I'll hold the fort for you. And he was kind of like the young guy, like he was one of the young guys, and there was some other sort of senior members, and there was I think there was a big buying for like, takeover. And I mean, it was kind of getting pretty nasty, and like, Hymenaeus Alpha was no longer with us, and Hymenaeus Beta came, and it was like, it sort of really marked a very big sort of change in a lot of things, like I think, the continuity and the way things changed from the generations of the caliphs and stuff was really, really dramatic. And I think a lot of people, kind of were like, well, they liked it the old way, like it was a bit of a kind of happening scene, like I think it's pretty wild. I think the Bay Area, and there was a lot of stuff, like I think Mercury comes back, from the war and stuff, and then he's a political scientist or something, he's really kind of, a military man. And then he just ends up in this like Haight Ashbury's going on, and it's just like, wow, all right, let's blow some nadis or something, and then the OTO just explodes. I think, things were, fairly, sort of dwindling, but that's the American sort of tradition, with, those guys. But getting back to Australia, so there was a lot of conflict, and so a lot of stuff that was going down that was not good, and then so Heather, said, look, this is, I think from what is indicated to me, okay, well, this is, you got to dissolve the OTOs. It's not working out. Like here's a charter for the OIO, the Ordo Insularum Oceania. It's like this totally different magical sort of charter. And he's just like, what do you mean? And it was like from Grady. And it was basically kind of like a charter to start a new magical order. Yeah, right. Okay. And so then I think that like this was an opportunity, and if I could kind of speculate on myself from what, the conversations and the time that I've spent, I think this was like, a thing where the order was basically on the verge of extinction, I mean, a lot of friends were lost, a lot of, it was a lot of blood, sweat and tears, a lot of, Shiva was like left with this big thing, and I think he knew how big it was because, and he had, it was a lot of soul searching stuff, but then I think he got the download, and it was like, I think he saw down the you know, like he saw down the respective timelines and he said, no, I got to like keep the, you know, I got to, you know, we've got to get through. The order's got to survive. The OTO has to survive.
Any organisation, you know, has its ups and downs and
yeah, this was
issues,
pretty extreme.
You know.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's human nature, right?
Yeah.
And the OTO sort of deals with, you know, the promulgation of philema and you know, in an outward sort of form. And so it deals with, you know, it deals with people and groups and stuff like that. And it's kind of pretty tough because the world's like the clipod, you know. It's like, you know, it's like, well, it's a pretty big task, and it does come with those things. And I think that they're the ordeals that the order kind of goes through naturally, you know, in the application of the sociological experiment, which is sort of trying to kind of like apply philemic principles to community and stuff like that.
Well, yeah.
No easy task, but nonetheless, you know, it's like a noble venture. You know what I mean? So I think that Shiva was at that sort of stage, and he just kind of put that other one away, but like there was no one left. You know, there's very few left, and I think at that sort of stage, and then, you know, my 2 years was up. I was like, man, I'm joining the OTO, you know, like I'm like, so I kind of rocked up in the pub where he usually drank, and he was there with his you know, like so I rocked up, and I think that it was at a time where he's kind of like, you know, this decision had been made, but there was nothing to work with, and I said, rocked in and said, hey bro, I want to join the OTO. And then, you know, like, so subsequently, like
build it up from there.
You know, like, you know, what's her name? So Petra and me were, you know, like Shiva's first Minerval degree initiations, you know, and you know, more had come, and there were some old people like hanging around, but, you know, and it was like, and then it was like, okay, so, and then just really quickly, you know, well, the thing was, since 1980, it was like, since the 80s, you know, one thing that Heather was sort of doing, and that the OTO was doing the rites of Ulysses. They were doing them every year. They've been doing it for 13 years, you know, like, and it's just sort of like, it was something like, well, we got to do it. We got to, you know, do this. And that sort of led also to a kind of a really vibrant public rights agenda. And, you know, the rights are really sort of strange because they have this, well, the other thing is the rights, you know, from what I've, you know, from Shiva, they secretly invoke the AA, you know, and it's sort of like, well, we're in this sort of, you know, we're in this position, you know, where it's like, you know, the order is like, has been at that verge. We need to kind of seek a choose to give us some choices. I mean, this is coming from him, you know, like, and in hindsight and much sort of reflection, it's like, so the rights are a real trip, and also they provide this really amazing sort of opportunity that you kind of get to work with, you know, you get to kind of do some magic, you know, like in the preparation of the roles and the assumption of God forms, you know, the preparations of your incense, like your devotional work, your Libra start, I mean, the whole gamut, you know, and Libra, and, you know, everything's sort of, you know, it's kind of a really interesting thing. And the rites, they have this way of purging the order. Like they're a trip, you know, like stuff happens, and usually there's a blowout at Mars, and then things hit the fan at Lunar, but there's a lot of stuff that goes in between, and I think that sort of like just sort of seems sort of something that, because we did them so much, we could kind of sort of map certain sort of things out. So it's a magically cathartic process for a group of people to do, and some people go, well, you know, you don't want like too, you know, I mean, is that a good idea? And it's like, well, yeah, I think so. You're supposed to be doing that. You know, I think it's a good, you know, it's like, well, let's get out the impurities, you know what I mean? And, you know, so, and then the rights sort of led to other experimental, you know, and you know, unique sort of rights. We would, you know, make ourselves.
Did this seep into your art school practice as well?
Well, it's kind of strange because when I was at art school, SEA was it's a fairly conceptual kind of school. Sydney Tech, East Sydney Tech had one angle, and the National Art School. They all had these sort of slightly different orientations, and I think SEA was sort of priding itself that it was sort of like this highly conceptual one. But anyway, I had like people like Mike Parr and like that lecturing. I was kind of pretty lucky, and he's kind of like quite a renowned Australian performance artist. And I think I read, an essay, Flight from the Object, and then I had this like, I just went, right, I'm an artist without hands. So I'm just, so I just like, I got in with a portfolio of drawing, and then the next thing I know, it's like, I'm not doing any kind of, I'm not doing any kind of art that I need to, and so I actually, for my BA degree, I just did performance art,
Well, what did that entail, though? What kind of performance?
I mean, it's kind of, it's kind of hard to explain, but I was exploring some of those ideas in a performative kind of aesthetic kind of domain. Some of the concerns and the my magical and sort of understanding of things. I was using that as a different sort of language to explore and express those types of concerns. So yes, the occultism was always been at the core of my artistic practice. I saw the performance as a kind of a form of ritual, and and there was sort of these different, so I was definitely, and this was while I was squatting, and so I lived for three years without electricity while I was going to university, and getting good grades and doing great stuff and studying by candlelight, and we had a gas thing down in the communal kitchen, and this was a time. So when I was at art college was also a time that I was really getting into studying kind of Crowley, Western magical tradition, and things like that, and sort of practicing. I was my pranayama and asana in the morning. I'd do my I would like go to art school and do kung fu in the evening, go back, eat dinner, and then like do some study, and then do rituals at night. I mean, it was a really kind of like an ascetic sort of lifestyle. And it was just great. And meanwhile, we still had good times. We went and seen bands and stuff like that, but, when other people were kind of using drugs, I was doing magical rituals, so where were we? Yeah, so it did inform it. And
did it make it difficult at all in art school?
What?
Coming from a more of a magic perspective.
Yeah, it was
especially with teachers and things like that. Did that complicate anything? Like, I just really didn't fit the bill so well, but they really, the performance and the documentation of the performance stuff they really liked. But my, theoretical justifications for them, that was just abstruse. It was like, what the hell are you talking about? I'd sort of like remember my philosophy lecturer, it was Mark Jackson maybe, and he, I remember one of the essays was write an essay on the signature, and so I did a Kabbalistic breakdown of the signature and gave a whole commentary on the Kabbalistic breakdown and the Gematria and all of this. He was just like, this is really great because it's really unique. I've never, what I mean? Like, but, I think he was understanding, but I think it was just sort of a point of difference. But, it created problems I think in the end, because like, it was just, that's just what I was doing. And,
art school sometimes wants you to kind of fit into sort of some other box or something, I suppose. And I think I became sort of, in the end, when I did my postgraduate, I was just like, I had an outside assessor who really didn't get me till the end show. And it was kind of like, the coin, and I heard the coin drop, but it was already too late. And I was just like, look, I can't, I just need to walk away from this. And so, I mean, did some of the performative aspect, I suppose the thing with like dramatic ritual and stuff like that in a magical setting, it's not theatre, what's kind of, it's a type of sort of theatre, I suppose, but I mean, it's sort of, there's something different going on there. So I think some people are going,
less for an audience, perhaps, more for...
Yeah, well, I mean, like Crowley's whole thing with it was, he does this rite of Barzabel, and he sort of like decides to try out a new innovation in the art of evocation or conjure, and basically puts Victor Neuburg as the material basis, for Barzabel to to Barzabel to manifest in. And it's just a spectacular success, and he's with Marston, the general, and they make some kind of like, Barzabel, gives them some prophetic kind of information that turns out to be true. He thinks it's a great innovation in ritual magic, you know what I mean, for the, to use the person as the material basis. So you kind of get like some other times, and they sort of talk about the use of copious amount of dittany of Crete or something for, like a spirit or something needs a vehicle to manifest, to sort of the manifest in. Many other sort of, like the, I think the idea also of the Solomonic mirror, it was kind of like, I think that was like a great, I mean, Poke Runyon was kind of fairly responsible for putting that picture. So then basically the spirit becomes it's actually the reflection of the face that becomes the menstruum for the, for the spirit to manifest. I mean, there's lots of different sort of methodologies and stuff like that, but I think that Crowley was like, this is just such a spectacular success. Then he goes, I want to do this publicly, you know what I mean? And it's just like in true Crowleyan fashion, and so he comes up with the Rite of Artemis and then invites all of the press and stuff, and he does this sort of, he's going like, I'm going to kind of apply this kind of, he wanted to kind of, revigorate, bring religious ecstasy or like, into, to make it a palatable experience and elevate through this dramatic ritual form. It has precedences as well with the Rite of Isis, that was done in, by Mathis, Mathis, and so there's this sort of idea, and then you've got like this other sort of connection with Peladon and the Salon de Rose Choir, where they're doing these orchestrated kind of like art performance kind of events. And I would say he's kind of like the proto-modern curator, where he's kind of got an idea and he's sort of, putting everything into place. But then Crowley sort of gets this, Rite of Artemis thing, and, involves like dancing and, dance and music and invocational poetry. And it's sort of, I think the crescendo with the rites of Ulysses, which was come after the rites of Artemis, was that, like Neuburg would become, would go spinning, like a spinning top across the floor when he would just like totally, overcome with the slain in the, I don't know, but the Rite of Artemis, and then, he just sort of added a mescaline punch for good measure, and it was like a spectacular success. Everyone was like, oh, that was great, I'm sure it was. And then from there, he's like, well, this is, why stop here? And so he developed the rites of Ulysses, and then there you go. And it was like, that was pretty much a recruiting ground for the AA as well. Like, and I think that, and the interesting thing about the rites is that, so getting back to that sort of idea, they're not just a theatre, they're a dramatic ritual rite, but when you look at it, it sort of tips its hat to the traditions of like the Grecian kind of, the oratory tradition and the drama. It's almost sort of like cast in that sort of neoclassical kind of idea, which was really prominent around the sort of like towards the latter part of the 18th the 18th or 19th century, like 1850s or something. There was this, and onwards, where there was this sort of real move towards, it was like there was real revival with like people wanting to get back. There was this emergence, like even when Australia was sort of doing its, trying to kind of consolidate all the states, it was sort of like there was this real kind of, there's a strong neoclassical sort of movement. And I think that's sort of reflected. So you've got this sort of like tilting its head to sort of these Grecian plays and sort of the dramas of the gods and stuff. But then embedded within the structure of the rites is like a corpus of thelemic magical rituals. From, if you look at like the ones that are in there, and they're kind of nestled in them as kind of like they're in there and they're performed by a person nestled in there. So it's like a really curious kind of capsule, because someone going to those things, they might be used to the poetry and the form, and then all of a sudden you've got this hardcore, you've got this sort of, like the hexagram or the whatever ritual, or like Libra Yod. And it's like, what the fuck's going on here? And it's like nestled in there, and it's sort of like, so it was a combination of like, I think, showing people what is part of what would be ostensibly a private practice, right? Of an aspirant or, like a magician or whatever. But then it's presented within the kernel of this sort of like larger drama of like, the soul's journey through the planets, from like Kronos to, Pan and all of that sort of stuff. So it's kind of a trip. And I think that form, so I think, what was I trying to go with this? So I don't know.
The art is magic.
Well, yeah, I mean, Crowley says so. And so I kind of sort of, I was a bit schizophrenic in a way. Like, I wasn't like, and then also with the OTO, I kind of had fun with the punk rock scene. I could sort of still do my flyers, and I could still draw and do some sort of kind of cool stuff. And then within because the form of dramatic rituals is so different than, say, performance art I was doing, it was kind of different, but it was sort of like, well, that's cool here and that's cool here. There was no, it wasn't sort of, schismatic. It was like, well, that's that and that's that. So
everything has a time and a place, really.
Yeah.
Of course,
So I think I hope that
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, that would lead you on to your success, and also your success overseas.
Well, I suppose success is a relative kind of term, but I think that one of the symptoms of being an Australian is that we're a continent which is a long way and quite isolated down in the Antipodes, like from the rest of the world. So often when Australians travel, they have to go a long distance, and they kind of like have far-reaching travels and stuff. So for me, it's I always wanted to travel from when I was young, and I think that traveling initially was part of me exploring my own interests in magical culture and esoteric and occulture and, various different things, which I kind of was aware there was, people around the world and things happening that I kind of really wanted to kind of like experience. So because I had an interest in art and magic, things like if there was sort of things that were happening overseas, like one of my early trips was to go and see the Crowley show at the October Gallery in London. So I kind of, I thought, wow, that'd be really incredible. I want to see Crowley's art, and they had some of the Thoth cards and some of the early renderings of those cards, and I think Kenneth Anger was going to be out there giving some talks, and actually it was really interesting because Kenneth Anger kind of gave a sort of a presentation on the travel bureau. It was like a travel brochure that Crowley had sort of cooked up for people wanting to come to the Abbey of Thelema. And it was like really mind-blowing, because in that brochure was these descriptions of all of Crowley's panels that he'd painted in the Chamber of Horrors and all of that. I think everyone, the first night or so when they came, they had to kind of go down into the chamber that was like surrounded by all of these kind of murals, which had every humanly vice and all sorts of things, and dosed up on mescaline and all the rest of it. I think, and that was but these descriptions of Crowley's like murals, and I'd seen some from the early was like, I think it was like Anger and Kinsley sort of there, these old photographs and some other photographs of like the Abbey, which had sort of kind of fallen into sort of disrepair. So they always really fascinated me, because I was like, well, here's the the prophet, here's the great beast kind of like putting it down in an artistic, putting his kind of thing down in an artistic expression. And so, that was really incredible to actually sort of, it was something I didn't know was going to happen, but it was like really, really evocative for me. I thought, oh, well, how cool would it be to paint your own Chamber of Horrors? Like I thought this was always sort of like a... And then there was, like Crowley's art, and there was Quar, and there was this incredible, drawings and paintings and stuff. And then, and I, being a naive art student, I sort of like, oh, I'm just going to take my little portfolio, and sort of like maybe I can kind of give it to some people, and so I kind of did. And I, it was interesting, I didn't really know anyone over there, but I made some sort of connections with the order, and then I sort of got billeted out with one of the, I think it was like a young member in the order, Simon, and we continue to be friends to this day, and so, and it was just incredible, because, and the thing that was really great about it was like, there was like people coming from all over Europe and America, and there was people in London, and it was just this really exciting sort of thing. And so everyone would sort of like hang out at the gallery afterwards, and people were mining the gallery, and it was just incredible. And on that sort of trip, I'd sort of I'd sort of like given like Hymenaeus Beta a copy, and I'd sort of given a few other friends a copy, and one of my other friends from Robert Fitzgerald, he was very good friends with Andrew Chumley. And I'd sort of, so I kind of met Andrew and stuff like that. And then I think both Beta and Andrew made a call to Robert Ansell from Fulgur and sort of said, hey, there's this like kind of young artist from Australia. Maybe you should meet up. And then I went and had fish and chips around the corner from Sotheby's Rare Books, with Andrew Himan. And like, we were talking about sort of stuff. And that's sort of how I met Robert Ansell and those cats. It was always sort of like an opportunity for me to travel, and I always like to sort of like kind of travel with a couple of different agendas. I wanted to kind of like sort of research or look at something, and I wanted to look at for some other possibilities. From there, like back to, I think the earlier days, kind of just when I'd sort of left art school, and I sort of collapsed just into sort of like my own magical practice, and my art really became sort of subsumed in that, or became, my artistic practice was my magical practice, and it was sort of like a way in which I was, expressing my own sort of inward journey, I suppose. And I kind of did a few earlier sort of exhibitions, and then I started drawing again, like I'd moved back to some of my sort of, I'd moved away from performance sort of art, and I'd sort of started sort of doing sort of, drawing, and I had a fairly rigorous sort of, I was exploring a lot of automatic drawing techniques, and I was really fascinated by, the surrealist sort of techniques and spiritualist sort of techniques of sort of the automata, sort of like, things like that. So I was kind of exploring widely different artistic techniques as a sort of a method to induce sort of different types of trance, or capture sort of different ambiences of like magical rituals and things like that. So I had a couple of early exhibitions in Sydney in 1995 and 97, was sort of some drawings, and I was also kind of like working with a collaboration, an artistic kind of collaboration with two other guys, called NOCO project, and then we were exploring kind of audio visual, so ritual sound and documentation, video and stuff like that. So we incorporated some of those into our early exhibitions, and I think then from there, I'm kind of getting back to Australia, I suppose, but I think that the Crowley exhibition really inspired me, and that one of the things that I thought was really important from my younger years is that, being, one of those kind of overly enthusiastic kind of types of...
that got you places, though, being enthusiastic.
Well, I was young, and I was wide-eyed, and I was enthusiastic, and I suppose I was just like, I was kind of full of energized enthusiasm, And one of the things that I thought was really important with the order locally, and with Oceania, Oasis and Lodge, was that I thought, look, thelemic culture, it's really important, and magical and esoteric culture, it's really important to have a sort of a broader aesthetic kind of expression, so art and culture and writing and sort of thelema beyond Crowley, and not beyond Crowley, but taking those kind of that sort of like that essence and sort of refracting it through kind of like the cultural paradigm and time that you found yourself in, and sort of like coming up with kind of sort of different modes of expression, and just that sort of stuff. Is like and so we and also sort of like part of a homage, when I was kind of quite young, I'd come across the figure of Rosaleen Norton, and she was really kind of I'd seen the early kind of picture book of the plates that were sort of destroyed by judicial sanction and stuff, and there was still kind of like people who knew her in there was like an old sort of esoteric bookshop at the back of King's Cross in Potts Point, and the guy who the people who run it, they knew Rowie, and they had her books, and so she was sort of like the shadow. There was other members that were older members that were involved in the OTO at different part in the old days. They knew and worked with Norton, and I just sort of felt the Witch of King's Cross, and she was an artist. Like she went to East Sydney Tech, she studied with Rainer Hoff, she modelled for Norman Lindsay, and she had a kind of like a really, her art was really sort of dark, and it was really kind of like, like she was enfleshing her kind of, visions and sort of pandemonic kind of like incredible sort of stuff. And then she was this like, character that sort of sat at the Apollon Cafe, had a murals at the pub down on Princess Highway, and she was just a real character, and I just loved her. And I was fortunate enough through Basilisk Books in Melbourne, and to meet Keith Richmond, and now he's at Wiser Antiquarian, and he was really an authority on Norton, and we, like members of the OTO and stuff, like we had kind of fairly good relationship, because he's got his own history as well, which is really fascinating in relationship to Crowley and all of that jazz. But we had some sort of connections there, and he had connections with the estate, and I kind of thought, well, wouldn't this be a great idea to do an exhibition of Rowie's art? And I don't think it had been she hadn't had an exhibition in 35 years or something like that. She'd been kind of like forgotten largely. And I mean, Neville Drury did a great, his book got like kind of quite a lot of mileage, and I think he kind of broadened her people overseas to who she really was. And because she was like kind of like one of my patron saints, she was this like amazing occultist woman artist who just like flicked a thumb at all, like her.
She was badass.
She was badass, you know what I mean? Like she just went against the grain, and she was persecuted for it, and she stuck to her guns, and she's just like, she was like a a hero of mine. And so, yeah, we you know, it's like, so then, you know, with the OTO and Keith Richmond's, you know, assistance, you know, we went and, you know, got a whole bunch of her art, which was quite difficult, really, because, you know, she would paint on anything. So she would paint on masonite and stuff, and this is like old stuff. So it's just like, God damn you, you know, why you know, but it is what it is. And we put an exhibition on in King's Cross, you know, and that was really, and you know, because I thought, like, it's good to make a homage to the ancestors and to kind of really, you know, pay respect to your ancestors and show that, like, that you're kind of part of, I wouldn't say necessarily like a continuity, but at least kind of like in the spirit of or something. And so that was really important to me. And I think you know, we did some publications, the Waratah and you know, I think that I'd looked at broad. I was a big fan of esoteric kind of fanzines and journals from overseas, you know, like I'm just trying to remember the names of them all now. Used to collect them all, the Cincinnati Journal, Ceremonial Magic, the early Typhonian sort of works, and just the whole gamut, new at Isis sort of. And I thought these things were fabulous, and I always loved the art.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, you know, let's do something with a lot of art and you know, original writings and stuff. And so we did that. And that was sort of like part of like, you know, I think an early like agenda, which I think we were quite successful in doing. And that sort of kept going. And other sort of trips overseas, I remember reading in a Magical Link, I think in maybe 1989, late 80s. It was from the late 80s. Talking about Harry Smith, and I was kind of quite inspired, particularly that Harry Smith had been working with Enochian concordances and had done these artworks based around the Enochian watchtowers and made an analogy between the Enochian watchtowers and the Highland Tartans, and I was like, this is fantastic. And I'm like, I'm on the plane, you know. well, what happened? And he done a lot of work with various older members, I think, of the OTO, and one guy, Kem Kagan, sort of. So I had the archives address, Randy Singh, from the Harry Smith archives, which I believe was down in Alphabet City in those days, and I managed to get Kem Kagan's number, and you know, so we went and had a conversation too, and I'm knocking on the door, and Randy answers, and she sort of like produces these kind of like the works that I wanted to see. And so, I mean, I was just really always fascinated. And then, you know, he'd done, you know, I was aware of Harry from the paperback edition of the Holy Books, you know, and then I kind of got into his films and then, you know, his ethno folk recordings and it just sort of the world's unfolded. And I was just like, who's this fantastic guy, you know, like, and, you know, but it was the Enochian content that sort of kind of got me going, because it was sort of something, particularly in my own magical practice, that I'd really taken to. From there, I kind of like travelled down to Mexico and numerous different sort of times. The other kind of significant artistic sort of travels was there was a couple of spare exhibitions that happened in London, and they were fantastic. And again, they were like these kind of epicenters where I kind of met a lot of interesting people and thought, you know, like the occult world's much broader than what you see in Australia. And that was a really kind of fantastic experience for me. Made some really great connections with some really interesting and fabulous people. And a lot of those people I still have connections with today. And I suppose because, you know, in many senses, they were motivated to go from their country to there to see something that, you know, so we kind of had a base of shared interests and things like that. The other, I'd gone to London as well I had 2 exhibitions in London. I had one exhibition at the Horse Hospital, and that was kind of largely because of Jack Sargent. And that, you know, so I'd sort of exhibited a series of 36 drawings based on Libra 231, and also some animation stuff that I'd sort of done with another guy named Dan Winter. And I met some fabulous people. I met Peter Whitehead on that trip, which was like remarkable. I think that was around the centenary of the Book of the Law, so I was kind of off on a plane to, to foyers to do some stuff, like heading up. Sorry?
Oh, did you notice any cultural trends, I guess, in regards to the art in these different places? Is there kind of a different flavour going on in different places around the world?
Well, I think for the large part, people like Crowley and Spare's a sort of slightly different story, but largely people didn't really pay much mind. I mean, like the Crowley thing, it was sort of like sort of more from this kind of curious, that's that guy, that's the usual kind of stuff that's surrounded by Crowley from, and he's, the wickedest man in the world paints, and it's like, but so I think, the esoteric content and stuff like that, I don't know how much, that kind of really seeped into a more, I don't know how to say it, like a broader perception of, I think it was just more curious that these guys happened to be into sort of occultists, and they sort of like, Crowley was such a infamous figure, and Spare is a bit different because, he was such a consummate draftsman, and a lot of people collected him and things like that. But as for sort of, there wasn't like these trends in esoteric art or anything kind of back then, I don't think. Largely, you would find sort of small enclaves maybe in outsider art, or, like it was not really considered a valid place to come from, because it was like, well, what's that? You know?
Not the mainstream.
No, definitely not the mainstream. And then another exhibition I had at the Candid Arts Centre, which was paper cuts and automatic drawings and some stuff that I generated through my Anoki magical work. Because I gave a lecture there with, I think David Rankin was giving a lecture on his material related to Enochian magic, and some new translations that he'd sort of done. Lon Milo Duquette did a sort of an ether one, and I did a workshop on the permutations of the Enochian alphabet, and which was kind of cool. It was kind of cool, and so it was sort of like a conference art exhibition, and it was kind of fun. It was really, really, really great. And then from there, I think in 2009, the collective that I was working with, NOCO, was invited to perform at the Equinox Festival. And that was a kind of like a weekend of like talks and book vendors and magical ritual performance kind of, and bands and stuff. So you had like TAGC and Chris from Coil and Chromus came out of the to play, and then Arctos from had come to perform from Finland, and that was really great to meet them. And we'd performed the Conjuration of Beelzebub, and that was the year that Legion 49 was launched, so it was kind of a double bill. And then after that,
let's talk about Legion 49. That leads us on to the next question.
Yeah.
And it's an artwork that you continually revisit. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, the seeds of Legion 49 sort of were harvested in my travels through Mexico, and I'd come across the Atomi Indian paper cut tradition. And one of the aspects of the Atomi Indian paper cut tradition, a lot of the it was kind of originally out of barks. They would harvest these barks and make these kind of paper cuts, which were kind of used in these votive ritualistic fashions for harvest and corn gods, and and various agrarian and sort of elemental kind of sort of different gods and stuff that they would work with. But one aspect of them was the bad airs, and these were this kind of collection of really curious kind of like demonic kind of looking kind of characters. And I did a little bit more research into them, and said they were kind of like a fusion between Spanish Inquisitional culture, because the Amerindian tradition. And they were kind of really curious. So they would have like kind of bald heads and goatees and boots, and like these people didn't grow beards and they didn't have boots and stuff. So the bad guys were actually the people that were oppressing them. And that Montezuma was in there, you know, like Montezuma was like one of the bad guys. And so it was like this pantheon of chthonic, their, you know, chthonic deity. And they were used in these kind of exorcistic kind of rites to take away like ailments and, you know, if different people were afflicted in a kind of like a shamanic sort of based sort of thing, and the heirs, you know, like the bad guys took the bad stuff away and then, you know, they were disposed of, you know. And for me, I've always been really attracted to folk art traditions, especially when they express sort of the indigenous spirituality. And there's a sort of an ephemerality to folk art, I find, and there's an expedience, and a lot of it's ephemeral and it gets done every year. And so that it's really kind of highly stylized, and it's just kind of like through that process of reiteration and redoing, they've come to these really refined kind of raw expressions of what it's about. And I just really ran with them. And well, I just really liked them. And I sort of did a little bit of further research on which there's not an incredible amount. But, you know, I came across, I think it was in the Crowley's Scented Garden of Abdullah the Satirist of Shiraz. There's an interesting footnote in his poem called Jinn, where he lists the 49 servitors of Beelzebub from the Sacred Magic of Abramelin, and then there's a description, like there's actually a description of what they look like, and I'm like, what the hell, that's fantastic, you know, like I was like, wow. And it said that you know, that it was these images were produced by a prominent Irish woman psychic. And I was like, okay, who's that, you know? And then, you know, sort of kind of dug into it a little bit further, and there's a kind of, I think it was a footnote from York, I don't know, in Crowley's Goetia or something like that. I don't know. I'm not 100% of these the details of where that mention is, but it was it said FF, so it's quite probably Florence Farr, right? And that it was produced at a meeting of the Ghost Club, and the Ghost Club was this it was like a kind of like a meeting place where society people, members of the Golden Dawn, Horror Rise, Arthur Mack, and all these really great poets and people were there, and I think they kind of have sort of seancey things or readings of, like, you know, it's like a rocking good time, right? Yeah. But at one of these sessions, you know, that they you know, somehow procured in some psychical session, where there was a seance where they're flipping, you know, like sigils generated or magical squares with the 49 servitors of Beelzebub. I don't really know the process. I'm quite fascinated about it. And then she's having a vision and they're writing it down. Yeah, and I went, this is fantastic. And I've always had a real soft spot for Beelzebub because I think he's kind of like underrepresented, you know, and through my interest in the Grimoire Verum and various different, you know, I kind of got a really rich interest in the chthonic and demonolatry and, you know, and all of that stuff is always sort of, and also grimoires, because I'm kind of like a real visual kind of guy as well. So I love magical seals and demon signatures and all of that sort of stuff. And so I thought, wow, this is really fantastic. So I, you know, came on the idea of using kind of the Atomi Indian idea of making these paper cuts to give form to these images, that these cyclical images that were delivered in a session of the Ghost Club, give them some form. So that's where the paper cut idea done, you know, that's where that paper cut idea came from.
They're quite iconic. I think that they've got this as they stand out. That's quite interesting to look at. Yeah,
I think that they've got they got something. Yeah. But the interesting thing is, so when I looked into it further, you know, I was looking at Mather's edition of the Sacred Magic, and because the, you know, looking at the chapters of the magical squares that relate to Beelzebub, and then I'm looking at it and I'm kind of, familiar with the names, and I've done some comparative names because there was the Dean edition, and so I'm comparing different editions, and I'm comparing the names of the 49 servitors, and there's some variations across different manuscripts. But also when I was looking at the squares, I was like, oh, hang on a minute, I recognise that name. And what I sort of found is that the name of the servitors is embedded in this, within the magical square, the magical squares. But then what I found is like, well, hang on, that chapter is not. That those names aren't there. And like Mathers had like either purposely or unbeknownst to himself falsely associated one of the chapters of the magical squares that wasn't to Beelzebub, because I found them in a different chapter. Yeah, right. So the actual names were embedded in the magical squares, usually from the center line, sometimes as an anagram, sometimes as a palindrome, sometimes whatever, but they were there. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. This sort of stuff you don't really know unless you kind of get your hands sort of dirty. And you know what I mean? Like really kind of go in. And so... And that's how... And so I'd actually done the paper cuts, and I remember I'd done the paper cuts before Legion 49, and I'd also sort of done the 10 Philosophers of Decadence from Levi, his descriptions of the Cliphotic Kings. And I'd also done the 10 descriptions of the Cliphoth from Liber Ararita. So it just sort of became my...
Your thing.
A chthonic, you know what I mean? Like it became a bit of a process. It's like, but I'd had this dream, right? I had this kind of quite lucid dream where I went up to this kind of, it was, there was like some Chinese New Year firecrackers going off here. It was sort of like this sort of tall buildings, and some of the walls were open onto, and I was into this, went up to this small room, and there's this guy like sitting down, and he looked like a kind of like a Turton or something. Like he looked like a Bon Po kind of dude. He had a huge top knot and like dreadlocks, and he sort of dressed in sort of a kind of what looked like a Tibetan sort of thing, and he had this long table, and he had this book which was this really big tome, and it was a fold out book, and I was kind of taken into the room, and I sort of sat down next to him, and he's kind of drawing this image of like a wrathful kind of elemental kind of, I don't know, Bon Po entity or something like that, and he'd kind of finished it, and then he kind of folded it up, and then he moved it to the side to me, and then put the pen on top, and I'm like, what the hell? And it was like, and there was, because there was all these blank pages, and I'm like, I'm supposed to add to this book. So, and I was like, oh, wow, what, this guy's giving me this book, and then there was all this stuff in there, and it was like, you're the person who, like the idea that I had, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words a little bit, was, you're going to give these demons form, you're going to give them depiction, you're going to bring, you're going to give them images or something. So I was like, okay, rightio.
Yeah, right. And
in some strange kind of like weird narrative or something, I realized, it's like, I'm supposed to depict these things. I'm supposed to give them shapes and forms, and I'm like, like a demon drawer or something. Like, I didn't know what I mean. Like, and so I kind of took it. I was like, okay, well, yeah, I got to do that sort of stuff,
Right. So your subconscious was basically telling you what you're supposed to be
doing. I don't know if it was subconscious or like an old Bond badge. I don't really know, but yeah, something was kind of
something.
And so then when I went to see the Traces of the Sacred exhibition at the Pompidou, which was kind of like a really kind of probably the most significant survey of the current of esoteric, and they were looking particularly at sort of like the Theosophical Society and kind of Rosicrucian ideas and various other kind of influences through art and through the modern era into sort of contemporary. It was like a bit of a survey exploring that since the exhibition The Spiritual in Art in America, which was a long time before when those sort of ideas were sort of looked, and they brought to prominence people like Hilma af Klint, who was a couple of decades before Kandinsky, and he was kind of like in his treatise and sort of formulation of abstraction is using Annie Besson and Leadbeater's like on thought forms, and and Rudolf Steiner's kind of ideas of somehow artistically expressing the ineffable and things like that. And I sort of started to see that there was these people that were precursors to sort of modern art.
Yeah, well, let's move on to Noko as well, because that's a similar thing where you keep revisiting the same ideas.
Yeah, I suppose that, to answer the question that you sort of started with, is I always return. I have these number of different bodies of magical research which I explore, and there's also artistic output, a residue as part of the process, and I continually return to these themes. I do iterations and further explorations of that. So like Noko 210 was really started at art college, and I'd met Scott Barnes, and Scott Barnes was who I collaborate. He's a sound artist, and he was a flatmate of a guy that I shared my studio with in art school. So that's how we got to know each other. And he was working with another guy, Michael Strum, who was doing a lot of computer animation and early kind of computer generated sort of stuff. And a lot of his content was concerned with Jewish mysticism and the Kabbalah and stuff. And I think he sort of told me, when he graduated from East Sydney Tech, he kind of he'd just read Crowley's book 4, dropped some acid, saw some fireworks, and then he was off to like Jerusalem to study with like the Hasids, because he thought he had to learn Kabbalah to join the OTO. But then he met me many years later, and he's like, well, let's just do something. So we decided to do something, and I was like, well, I don't know what to do. So I had a Xerox copy of like The Vision and the Voice, one of those kind of like ones you sort of pick up at the back of bookshops, because there's no other way that it was like disseminated, and Crowley's Atlantis. And then from there we triangulated and also worked with another girl, Michelle Moo, and I decided that, okay, well, let's explore the Enochian watchtowers, and that took us like 3 years. We explored the tablets really rigorously, and we incorporated within the magical methodology and our creative process the integration of sort of Kabbalistic data or different data into the generation of sound, also recorded and like responded live time sort of mixing, and Michael, Scott would be generating, he'd have pre-generated stuff and live stuff and doing that, and I'd be doing kind of a watchtower operation with Michelle, and Michael would be recording and generating kind of, so it was an audio-visual kind of art magical project. We did that for many years, and we produced sort of different documentations for that along the way. And I continued to sort of work with Scott for many years on various projects, and like a really big emphasis for me was the Enochian magical system and the Enochian alphabet in particular. And we've been pretty much exploring through different operations. So I would sort of set forth like, okay, well, this is kind of what we got to do, explore the permutations of the Enochian, 21 permutations of the Enochian alphabet, or how the inherent structure of the Enochian alphabet, how we can pry them apart, and how we can generate magical letter squares with the Enochian alphabet, translate those to sort of data sets, and for those data sets to be kind of retranslated into kind of like Chuck or different sound coding devices and various sort of things. So we were just using, I think what Scott would say is, like the earliest form of practice is just like clapping some bones, having a fire, and like, doing singing, and we're just using kind of modern technology and a different tool set to kind of like articulate that. And so it just became sort of something that was a integral part of like my magical investigation. Like when we were doing Legion 49, weekly I was doing the conjurations and formulating the ritual praxis, my own ritual praxis, to kind of get the information that I wanted to do with Scott doing magic. So my research and that artistic magical exploration and my own work all kind of sort of run in tandem all the time. And so predominantly another sort of exploration, a big body of work that we did was like the Hypercube, which was like a really rigorous investigation of the 21 letters of the Enochian magical system, and so we produced large bodies of work.
Tell us about the basement.
All right. So we worked in a basement for many years in Drummoyne. And so that was kind of like the NOCO laboratory. So we'd be sort of spending time down there. It's got a concrete floor, and we could we were etching stuff. We were etching magical circles with thermite. I wouldn't advise that sort of stuff, and doing experiments how to take thermal mass out of incense, and really working on like crafting sort of like the structure of the. So it'd be like a Chinese parliament. We'd go like, okay, these are these different things. We only know these bits of information about Beelzebub. This is our source text. I'd do this survey of the eruptions of Beelzebub in different things, from the accounts of exorcism in London or something. Like the Beelzebub's plight from like the 1600s in America. And I would have all of these triangles where I wanted kind of like Beelzebub's voice in a thing, or somewhere where there was a rupture, or the Testament of Solomon or something like that. And so these are our things. And so how are we going to kind of, have the Grimoire Verum and other sort of methodologies of conjuration and stuff. So we would do a bit of a parliament. It's like how are we going to kind of like, so we would come up with like a base structure. Then once we would go along and sort of do the ritual, what would happen is we'd be sort of directed. I was like, okay, now you've got to do things like this. And we would sort of refine. So through the magical process, it was sort of like the agency would direct our next choices, or how to modulate the magical experience, how to refine it, and how to make it more bang on. You know what I mean? Like, and so we would just like sort of jump in and we go, well, we're going to do this till we work it out. And so it was kind of a very creative kind of space, and and then we would sort of like kind of document stuff and sort of put these parameters of like, well, who knows what the video will kind of capture, or who knows what the like Scott's a big fan of like phantom, he uses a lot of self-generated patinating machines and stuff, so there's this chance of like randomness and cyclic and like possibly anomalous sort of like artifacts sort of emerging. Like I read the I think it was Johannes Wehrer's depiction of the Infernal Parliament, and then we kind of like would sort of mash that back to sort of voice to text, and then from text to voice, and then it started like, it was like a kind of a cut up divination, it was like, well, hang on, how did that happen? So we were in a state of kind of play, and then serious magical, and really kind of like, visions and dreams, and, it was like a magical teleological. It was like a teleology in a way, but it didn't have any kind of end. It just sort of had, we need to get to this place. So in a sense, the magical operation becomes like an envelope where it's like you jump in and everything, your whole period of life from that time sort of starts to sort of become this kind of sort of capsule,
right, yeah,
in a relationship with agency and stuff like that, So the basement, and then we worked in a shed that was at the bottom of the flat, and we just liked concrete places and things that had really good acoustics and stuff that we could kind of like mark the floor, because like a big part of it was, was continually like exploring different magical circles or magical kind of matrices, which were different iterations and explorations of a magical matrix that you could
the space was important.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the space was conducive and it was a great space. At the moment, we're kind of in the sunroom. You know what I mean? Like, so, but it's all cool, and then sometimes, if my stepson's out of the country, it's like out goes the mattress and all shit's going on. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, so it's sort of like expedient at the moment. But yeah, so there's that sort of, I think, people like Burroughs and Geisen and, these different sort of methods and and sort of then different, like I'm kind of pretty hardcore into magical technology and sort of stretching the fold and sometimes coming up with sort of different ways of doing things too. So there's a great deal of experimentation, but there's a very rigorous process that's adhered to. There's a kind of a rigor of how we operate as well.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's been amazing talking to you. I'm glad to have you.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks for having me on.
We hope you've enjoyed the show. None of the opinions expressed by hosts or guests reflect the policies of OTO Australia, its members or officers. Until next time, we transmute and transmit. This is your host, Soror Myrrh. Love is the law, love under will.